I think we want to.
Our presenters this evening are Dr. Chuck Francis, Allie Loker, and Wally Graeber. And with that, I will leave. Chuck is with the University of Nebraska Horticulture and Agronomy. And Allie Loker is a graduate student, Doctor of Plant Health Program. And Wally Graeber is a local food advocate on the board of Hope and Harvest in Southern Heights Forest, Fun Forest. And with that, I'll let Chuck do the balance of the introducing. The topic this evening is wildlife, people, and food production, a bold vision for the future.
Great. Thank you, Stu. Welcome, everybody. It's a good-sized crowd from all over the state. I'll be introducing my two colleagues, Ollie and Wally, here in a minute. And we want to talk about how wildlife, people, and food all fit together and raise some questions about producing food and producing more food or looking for other solutions to the global food situation. I should ask, first of all, can everybody hear okay? Barbara says I tend to shout at the computer when I'm doing this. Can everybody hear?
It's better now than when you first started.
Better now, okay.
Yes, it's fine.
Okay, I'll lean forward then.
I didn't know you had it hooked up.
I did, but that doesn't.
Okay, sounds like we're all hooked up. We do want to start out by dedicating this tonight to Dr. Rosalyn Morris, who may or may not be watching. Rosalyn was the first woman to be a professor in our department of agronomy back quite a few years ago. And she was well known when she retired on the occasion of her 100th birthday here a few months ago. And I want to read exactly what somebody wrote. A former student in Australia said, if the drive for perfectionism was ever to take a human form, it would be Rosalyn. Excellent scientist and teacher, and one of the people who really kind of broke some barriers and opened us up to some new thinking and diversity in the department. We'll talk about that later. She also received the chapter Audubon Earthkeeper Award. And I remember seeing Rosalyn at noon pretty often after she'd retired, walking with her dog on campus, picking up trash and keeping the place clean like it was her own yard. And I learned from her. She was a role model for me too. And I still pick up things when I walk around. So let's go ahead and have Ollie introduce herself and then Wally.
All right. I'm Allie Loker. I'm a now second-year graduate student at UNL in the Doctor of Plant Health program. And I saw Dr. Vitiver is attending tonight, and I want to acknowledge that she was one of the founding faculty members of that program. So nice to see you and all of you.
Hey there, this is Wally. Yeah, thanks for having us tonight. We're really excited to be here. And I work with a few different organizations in Nebraska, including, as Stu said, Open Harvest and the Southern Heights Food Forest. I'm also on the board with the Nebraska Sustainable Ag Society and a co-leader of the Slow Food Youth Network here in the U.S. So excited to be with everyone. Glad to have be part of this meeting.
Okay, we'll launch into the topic and talk about interactions. And I want to add to what Ali said, that Ann Vitiver really was the founding person behind the Doctor of Plant Health, which is sort of like a professional program, like a doctor of veterinary medicine or a medical doctor. It's a professional degree for diagnostics, and it's a new program. And I think one of the real fantastic things about it is that it's a Doctor of Plant Health, not a Doctor of Plant Medicine. So it's looking at things, trying to figure out what's going on in the whole system, and then making a judgment on what to do about it, and looking at the effects on the whole system. So it's a really innovative program. We can thank Ann for getting that started. So thanks, Ann. So let's talk about how we interact with birds, and we're going to try and raise some questions, particularly about food production, but also about us and birds, and some of the sort of inconvenient truths that are out there, some of the myths about food. We end up interacting with birds, of course, whether we're watching or stalking or hunting, and hopefully with cameras. we like to watch in the wild and out in the backyards. We're also competing for resources. We like to see birds, but we like to keep them wild. We also invite them into our place. We put feeders out, and there are questions about that. Are we really reducing their fitness by feeding them? Or are we just compensating for having encroached on their habitat? At any rate, we try to minimize our impact, and our impacts are many. As a keystone species, we kind of dominate the planet in many ways, and we dominate the use of land and resources. So we need to ask questions like, who benefits from bird watching? Certainly the canaries coal mine didn't benefit too much from our use of them as indicator species. Yeah, let's go on to the next. We've all seen these kinds of graphs, such as the increase in human population that is likely to follow that medium scenario there, topping out at around 9.5 to 10 billion people within this century. And we have to make plans based on those projections. How are we going to feed all these people? What kind of habitat can we preserve? We see the obvious graph there on the right, and several of our speakers have talked about this and shown graphics about it and shown species in decline and all. And it's quite a spectacular decline in terms of billions of birds. And not all this is our fault, but a lot of it is, as we know. And it's not just farmland, it's feral cats or even domestic cats. It's cars on the road, it's glass buildings that attract with light and birds flying into them, and it's wind machines. And part of looking at the whole picture is looking at all those various ways that birds decline and figuring out what we can do about minimizing that. And our job, of course, in farming is to look at habitat loss, figure out ways to ameliorate that if we can, and do things like a farmer up in Minnesota we visit usually. We didn't this summer because of the pandemic, but he's a fairly big farmer, has 3,000 acres of corn and soybeans, but he never cultivates his fields until all the birds have fledged. All the prairie birds have fledged out of his fields. So these are things that some farmers are doing. And so when you look at chemical farming and all the monocultures, there are some good things going on. Here's sort of the challenge. A lot of people, of course, and these people are not equally distributed around. We have about, I think, 20 to 30 people per square mile in Nebraska. And when you get to a place like Rwanda, we have a lot of students in the University from Rwanda. They have about 240 people per square mile. So it's this kind of distribution that also confounds the whole problem of distribution of food. But the experts, and these are people from industry and university and demographers and all, estimate that with increasing incomes around the world, we're going to have to increase production by 70%. That's just taking our current trends in a lot of things. And it also takes into account some assumptions that we'd like to challenge. Protein consumption will increase, of course. We know that'll happen. But the projections say this will come from animal sources. Well, that's been the way it has been in the north. That's not necessarily a given. In fact, it's much more efficient for us to eat plant protein and to generate animal protein from grazing animals rather than feeding them a concentrated feed stock like corn and soybean and other high value, high protein, high carbohydrate that they didn't really evolve to survive on. So we need to figure that out. Put our cattle on pastures like those out in the sandhills, put our cattle eating things that we can't eat. Another one of the issues that comes up a lot is genetics, and we've been pretty good about this since the Green Revolution. We've increased yields a lot, but the assumption is sort of that that'll keep happening. And again, our experts, the plant breeders, say that most of our major crops, and those are corn, rice, and wheat, that provide about 60% of our caloric intake globally, that all three of those crops have sort of leveled off and plateaued, and we've kind of reached a genetic plateau on those. You've read a lot about food loss, particularly at harvest in third world countries, and a lot of food waste in developed places like here. And that may be between 35 and 50%. If we could solve a fraction of that, we can start cutting into that need to increase production by so much. Over the past 50, 60 years, Green Revolution time, we've been not only using genetics, but putting new lands into production. And folks, the new lands are about gone. We've been farming now for a decade or two, most of the really good land. And to farm other marginal land is very expensive, and it takes habitat away from other critters, and it brings us into closer contact. And some of the theories about COVID-19, of course, involve our proximity to animals. That's the theory on Ebola as well. And you also read about confined livestock populations, whether it's chickens in cages or swine in small pens or livestock ruminants in feedlots. We're cramming critters together and creating a situation where viruses, other critters can evolve quickly, and Anne could tell us more about that, I'm sure. But I'll tell you for sure, most of the conversation today where we work at the university is about how to produce more. And we assume that just producing more will assure that this gets out to food deserts and to people who don't have enough to eat. And so far that hasn't happened. So that's one of the inconvenient truths we want to challenge. We need to look for other solutions. So let's look at a few of these issues. Here's some myths that are around, are pretty prevalent. You read this all the time. US farmers are so efficient, they feed 100 and some other people, and they're going to feed the world. And in fact, that's never happened and never will. People need to feed themselves. We need to produce food closer to where people are. They need to produce under their conditions. And this is something that we saw in Colombia, that farming methods here are not necessarily the best methods somewhere else, and they must be appropriate methods, appropriate to the climate, of course, to the pests, other problems, appropriate to resources, appropriate to diets, appropriate to local customs. Genetics will solve the problem. We talked about that already. We're up on yield plateaus. It's very expensive to push those up any higher. We tend to focus in our business and research on single practices or single factors, and that'll solve it, whether it's no-till or center pivot irrigation or a new hybrid for corn. But in fact, we need to look at the whole system. And this is what we're all about in agroecology. And Ali will talk about education in a few minutes and why we need to look at systems as whole things. There's a lot of renaming too. If we just rename the system with something cute, that'll solve the problem. And there's a few of the titles there on the left-hand side. We feel pretty strongly that we need to educate people not necessarily on how to farm, but on how to think, because farming really is a human activity system, and we need to learn to think through challenges, look at the whole picture, look at the effect of what we do on the environment, on other species that cohabit the planet with us. The other thing is scaling up, which you read all the time, and obviously bigger is better. That's part of our culture. But I heard this term right sizing or right scaling from a professor over in Wageningen in the Netherlands, and I kind of like that. It's appropriate sizing, which might be scaling down, or it might be scaling up. Now, here in Nebraska, most of our grains don't feed people. Corn's a good example. 40% goes into ethanol, as you can see, about that much into ruminant livestock, into a number of other products like the plant up in Blair that produces plastic pellets. Less than 10% actually goes into human food. While we're on that, you should all know, you've probably read by now that 90% of the food we consume here in Nebraska comes from out of state or from other countries. So we're far from self-sufficient in food. And there's a lot of discussion about becoming more self-sufficient or more sovereign in our food system where we have control. And certainly farmers in our world have hurt when all the fracas came up about soybeans exported to China. And we're going to have more of those kinds of conflicts if we can't solve our things reasonably as a global community. In corn, since that's our big crop here in Nebraska with about 9-10 million acres, corn system is very inefficient at feeding people. If you put it through livestock, it's about a 9 or 10 to 1 proportion, 10 units in to get 1 unit out. It's also a very high user of water and nitrogen, other natural resources, vulnerable to shocks, especially our monoculture fields. We need to move toward more diverse fields, and diversity is generally good in lots of ways, including human diversity, which we'll talk about downstream here. And also our corn systems and about 7 other crops are highly supported by taxpayers. And the less representation we have in government in our farm states, the more vulnerable we are to loss of a lot of these federal subsidies. People think farmers are getting too much money, and in fact, when we do get a bailout like soybeans, the majority of that goes to a few large operators. So our system is built on getting big, and that's a problem we have to solve. There's a microbiologist out of UCLA, a philosopher named Rene Dubos, who said trend is not destiny wherever humans are involved. All these trends we're talking about are not something out of our control. They're not just something that's going to happen to us. We can make decisions to do things differently and use our resources differently. Just one example, we're sort of enamored with fancy lawns and monocultures and not a dandelion in sight. Not if you drive by our house, but that's our largest irrigated crop. And there's about twice as many acres in turf and golf courses and yards as there are in irrigated corn in the U.S. When I go out jogging in the morning, by the way, you notice right about in the middle of the slide that flock of starlings there. This is kind of the way I feel. If you went out to look at birds and you saw a flock of starlings everywhere you went, how would you feel about that experience? Well, I feel the same way when I look at places that I jog around in the wee hours of the morning and see all the monoculture lawns. To me, that's like a flock of starlings. I'd a lot rather see that, something like the one on the right there, where people are producing some food and vegetables and knowing where their food comes from. And we have our backyard habitat tour every year, and we see some of these places like the ones down across the bottom that you can create a lot of diverse habitat, good places for birds, pollinators, and all right in your own yards if we don't go with the monoculture lawns. So I guess diversity is good. Obviously in diets, diversity is good. Plants are good. Diversity in production systems and in people. We'll talk about that here downstream about our own department. We've got a new project that just is about to go in once it's approved here locally. That's going to look at systems not based on their immediate short-term economic returns, but on how to produce food. So this year, in fact, this summer, we've changed all of our field trials, and in my project at least, to food crops. And we're going to look at this nexus between healthy soils, healthy people, and healthy environments. And we've got 3 things we're looking at. One is food crops and rotations and using cover crops and all. Another diversity issue is education, and Allie's going to talk about that in a minute. Then Wally's going to talk about groups that bring people closer to the sources of food, nonprofit groups and others involving the food system. So wildlife habitat and populations they're kind of our modern day canary in a broad sense. And they're an indicator of good, resilient rural environments with pollinators, and birds are good indicators of that. So we're going to build this kind of strategy into monitoring what we do and be sure to include not just environmental issues, water quality, but also equity and who gets food. How do we feed people and how do we solve food deserts? Now we move to, maybe to Allie. I'm not sure what comes next. Yes, tell us about education, Allie.
All right, thanks, Chuck. It's a great framing for the remainder of the presentation. And I will start by presenting a framework for 21st century learning. So this framework was developed by educators, education experts, and business leaders to define and illustrate the skills, knowledge, expertise, and support systems that students need to succeed in work, life, and citizenship. So here is kind of the diagram that depicts this framework. And you'll notice that in the green here, we have the foundation, the key subjects. And these are what we traditionally think of as our different disciplines: English, economics, sciences, that type of thing. And it's there at the foundation because these key subjects and the content knowledge is still critically important for students to grasp. And so that's certainly part of this framework for 21st century learners. But the other piece that I wanted to highlight here at the top is learning and innovation skills. And so these are really what have been identified as different skills that really set students apart. So students that have skills like communication, creativity, critical thinking, they're much more well suited to thrive in this increasingly complex world that we're all living in. And the main component that I'll talk about is something called systems thinking. And you heard Chuck mention the word systems a bunch of times in his presentation. And systems thinking is really a way to integrate the key subjects and the content knowledge with these learning and innovation skills. So, so we're all on the same page about what systems are and what systems thinking is. I'll start out with some definitions, and I do want to acknowledge that these ideas are from Donella Meadows, who was an environmental scientist, educator, and writer, and she wrote a whole book on this if you're interested, called Thinking in Systems. So a system is a set of things that are interconnected in such a way that they produce their own pattern of behavior over time. And so what Chuck and Wally and I are primarily familiar with are agricultural systems, but I imagine that there are lots of systems that each of us interact with every day that we can kind of identify. Another part of this is that the components interact with each other and also other systems to produce a function or a purpose. And so systems thinking is a way that we can take a look at some of the complex problems like, feeding our growing population, creating enough wildlife habitat for birds and other creatures that we all enjoy and that play a critical role in our ecosystems. And looking at these problems and trying to find what is a root cause, or what are root causes of these problems, and most importantly, how can we come up with new opportunities for solutions. So a current example of systems thinking that Chuck already alluded to is our current pandemic. So this graphic from the UN depicts some of the different systems or factors that are increasing our transmission of zoonotic diseases. We'll see things like deforestation and land use changes. So when we take down forests to build houses or to farm, we are then moving ourselves, humans, closer to animals and wildlife. There are issues like regulating wildlife trade, which I am no means an expert on, so I won't go into that too much. But intensified agriculture and livestock production is another factor that increase the transmission of these diseases. We have things like antimicrobial resistance and climate change. So all of these different elements are systems in and of themselves, and then they also interact with one another to increase our likelihood of getting these zoonotic diseases. So this isn't strictly an agriculture example or strictly a wildlife example necessarily, but something we can all relate to and are experiencing together. So a systems thinker, and this is what we're trying to cultivate in the university, are students that are prepared to address these complex problems and tackle them head on. So some habits or characteristics of systems thinker: they're someone that seeks to understand the big picture. They identify a circular nature of complex cause and effect relationships. Surfacing and testing assumptions, not just taking things at face value, but asking why and asking how and what can we do differently. They also consider an issue fully and resist coming to a quick conclusion, very important skill. Making meaningful connections both within and between systems. And they also change their perspectives to increase their understanding. And I would just encourage you to, as we continue on, think of other habits or characteristics of systems thinker that you might identify. So in a classroom, this can be applied in a number of different ways. Part of the beauty of systems thinking is that we really want to engage students as active participants. So a concept that we use in agroecology is co-learning. So placing everyone, including the instructor, on more of an equal playing field where we're all trying to gain understanding and experience from each other and learn together throughout a course. Students in a flipped classroom might prepare or listen to a lecture ahead of class, and then the in-class portion is very much engaging and testing their knowledge and practicing some of the systems thinking that we're talking about. In general, in a course, identifying existing systems together that might be relevant to that class, and importantly, including and soliciting examples from other disciplines. So this is something I personally love about the Doctor of Plant Health program, is that we take courses in all different disciplines, and that really helps us as students be prepared to look at problems from a variety of different angles. So not just plant pathology, not just entomology or weed science, but we can use our understanding to identify maybe the root cause of an issue. And finally, integrating systems thinking into what the assignments look like and how we're assessing students and their knowledge is another way. So in agroecology, the course that Chuck mentioned and I also TA for, we practice this in a variety of different ways. We really try to discuss the ways that agriculture interacts and is interconnected with environmental, social, and economic activities. And as Chuck mentioned earlier, we want to kind of challenge the assumption that agricultural is just a production system, and really acknowledge that it is a human activity system. Humans are involved in each part of agriculture, and other animals, of course, too. And then a very specific example is that we're planning to assess the students' understanding of different units by having them create concept maps, which look something like this. So this could be something that a student turns in to show their understanding of how different concepts we covered in a course relate to one another and affect one another. And I'll close my section here by showing a real world example of how systems thinking can be used. These 10 principles for agrobiodiversity are put out by this organization called FACT, the Food Agrobiodiversity Clarity and Transparency. And you'll notice as we're going through these 10 principles that they aren't all from one discipline or even one sector, like the environmental sector. So promoting healthy soils is a principle they promote, increasing resilience to climate change, promoting nutrient security from the perspective of human nutrition and that security, enhancing livelihoods for women, recognizing that they play a critical role in both raising children, maintaining households, and in a lot of places around the world have a significant role in agriculture. Ensuring knowledge sharing, this is both informal and formal knowledge sharing, supporting the conservation of genetic and natural resources, empowering young farmers. Certainly in this country, we have a very aging population of farmers, and that's similar across the world. So how can we usher in the next generation of farmers that will feed us all in the coming years? Creating economic opportunities across the value chain, upholding resilient land use practices, which would include agroforestry and other conservation practices to enhance and increase habitat for birds and other wildlife. and then protecting indigenous and local cultures, including the relationships with the natural world and wildlife. So just some questions for you to ponder as you go forth. Just thinking about which of these principles stuck out to you most, and questioning why it did stick out to you most. Was it something that surprised you or something you're very familiar with? And then I would challenge you all to see, how do you think the Audubon and your chapter, the Wachiska chapter, can support and advance some of these principles? So many questions. The last thing that I would just encourage you to think about is given this this talk on, or this section of the talk on systems thinking, was this something that was incorporated into your education and formal learning? And if not, why do you think that was the case? And are there ways that you can apply systems thinking in your work or outside of work pursuits, including the work that you all do here with Wachiska? So I will pass it along to Wally to continue.
Sounds good. So I'm going to give everybody another minute there to think on some of the questions that Ali asked. I also saw that Stu unmuted himself. I don't know if he had an announcement to make or not.
No, I don't.
I know you're being a good moderator, so I want to give you. So my section of the presentation is going to be on a system that we're all connected to. It's going to be our local food system. This graphic was created by a food council in Ohio, and it looks at the different players and actions and segments of a community-based food system. So you could also think of that as a localized food system that relies on relationships throughout it, that with more diversity, it becomes stronger. So kind of looking at it as an eater, as a producer, potentially, if you're a landowner or you are working to grow food in a past life or a current life. Generally as a human, where do you fit in here? And also, what is your financial investment? So where do you spend your money? How do you invest in some of these sectors? And how have you been a part of a localized or community-based food system? I see Wachiska mainly working as an organization on the process side and the environmental stewardship. But of course, there are other places that you're working towards with farmland protection, community viability, economic development overall, and working with both policymakers on the outer edge, government agencies, and technical service providers. Now, if there's areas that we're not working in right now or you're interested in just knowing how these all relate together, I think is the best part. So to look at something that Audubon has done, and one that is kind of, it's very new. It started this fall on its full release. It's working with grazing management farmers, so ones that raise livestock for meat. As a quote from the Conservation Ranching Program Vice President, he says, "Where birds thrive, people prosper because birds need clean air, water, and land, and so do we." So this certification is something that, my knowledge, there isn't any current Nebraska producer that shares their food with this certification. But if it's something that you're interested in, obviously talking to the local producers that you know and saying, hey, if you became part of this program, it would ask you to create a wildlife management plan. It's voluntary. It takes about a year to become certified, but it's something that could increase value and obviously increases the wildlife habitat in this area localized. So a few of the graphics are just quotes from a video. I think we'll try to share our presentation, and I've linked the video. It's about a 3-minute segment of a farm in New Mexico that has transitioned and used the Audubon certification for friendly lands to gain a premium in their localized market in New Mexico. So since it launched in 2019, there are over 100 current cattle ranches. Part of the program is not allowing any feedlots to be a part of this. So there are kind of barriers to entry for just anyone. And then also they're practicing regenerative grazing across 2 million acres in 12 different states. So another organization I'm part of here in Lincoln is an urban organization that is the Southern Heights Food Forest. I wanted to kind of give an outlay of what the site looks like. In the upper left, there is a series of letters, and if we focused in on letter C on the right-hand side, that's going to be along 40th Street in Lincoln. It's going to be a 3-year-old site that is created under the title of a chestnut guild. And a guild, as far as looking at a system, is defined as an association, typically, of people working towards a common goal. But in the land management practice of permaculture, a guild is a grouping of plants, trees, animals, insects, and other components, all helping to ensure their health and each other's productivity. So kind of going back to what systems thinking is of, how are we supporting each other? What does one action do to grow their relationship with another one? A guild within permaculture and the Southern Heights Food Forest is an urban example of how we're creating an increase in wildlife habitat, in creating relationships between different plants, and then of course us as humans that would gain the benefit of being a part of that system. An example kind of out in the field, or as Wachiska has worked on in the past and started to more recently, is with ditches, so along the roadways. An example I wanted to share is out of Iowa State University, and they're doing prairie strips. So instead of taking and converting over 3 to 25 acres at a time, they're giving incentives through federal conservation reserve programs, also known as CRP, and they're planting a strategic, small, narrow. In this graphic, it shows has to be at least 30 feet wide and up to 120 feet. It's either along the edges of fields, along waterways, in a terrace, and a lot of this is to work towards keeping soil in place. Our biggest export in this country, as many may know, is the ground beneath us, and that's the topsoil that's so valuable to creating the food that we need in a localized system or on a global system. It's also going to improve water quality, as you know, prairies do. And third, that they name, is providing wildlife habitat. So as we start to think of how we can assist farmers in becoming better stewards of land while also creating habitat, doing these strips along specific erodible areas is by far one of the most important. So when you're connecting with farmers and you're looking to ask them, hey, what are you doing for creating wildlife habitat specifically for birds? Kind of understanding how much of your dollar that you spend on food, how much makes it to the farmer. As this shows, about 8 cents on your dollar, so about 8% only goes to the producer. The rest of it is sucked up in packaging, food processing, transportation of it, wholesale trade, retail trade, energy, financing, and advertising. So really understanding that if you're investing in a localized food system, many more pieces of your dollar go to the farmer. Obviously, they're invested and they have to take on the advertising, take on the trade, take on the transportation. But they're being, if they're efficient, they're being rewarded for it in a way that increases their profits and can likely invest that back in their land and back in hopefully a healthy habitat for animals. So kind of the what can you do slide, and kind of following off of the big problems that Chuck outlined and Ali put together with how we're thinking about where we're using our energy within the system. The first that I thought of, and I practice myself, is just buying local generally. So creating a direct relationship with the producers who may have a way to implement habitat and management plans such as this prairie strips. As a birder, you can be an advocate, right? Sharing your wildlife observations with food system members who share your values, or could be turn to share more of your values, that will over time say, oh, that certification that Nebraska doesn't have yet for grazing management, I could probably do that. Give me a year, But if enough people say something, I think it's over time, as you know, with what advocacy needs on a policy level, it takes years, it takes sometimes decades to get to a place where you want, but just having that conversation on a local level with producers is, I think, one of those first steps. And if we're grazing as a producer, if you're requesting farmers to take existing networks of the lands that Wachiska has or other remnants or strips, that can be another way to create the control and the disturbance to create healthy prairies. And then finally, as a conscious consumer, it kind of goes back to the buy local, but if you're actually consistently eating local and purchasing food that invests in land management that you value, and then of course, create the habitat that you want to see and you want to care about, that would be long lasting. Piece in that, I think, is being consistent, having those conversations, and really bringing up the values that you see and how that produces. Thank you. So these were the last pieces of my presentation, is just to look at the different organizations that I interact with, how they come off of the food system wheel or a community-based food system, and kind of just saying, if you're not aware of the organizations right now, reaching out to them either as a representative of Wachiska or saying, hey, we would love to strengthen this part of our mission. I heard in a presentation once that we align in different ways. Not that you haven't thought of that, but I think kind of extending that first conversation and knowing that you're part of a localized food system is kind of a nice way to have some camaraderie. And Chuck will be up next. I will unmute him. I'll ask to unmute him. And he'll have to go in and unmute himself. You're still muted, Chuck. Hey, Chuck, if you can hear me, you're still muted.
Hit your unmute, Chuck.
There you go. He's
Thank
got
you.
it. Well,
Thank
way
you.
to go.
Thanks for all the help. I need every help I can get. Thank you, Wally and Ali, both. I just wanted to make connection to a couple of people in the audience. One is Ingrid. Ingrid Kirst was kind of the organizing force and motivator behind the Southern Heights first Southern Height Food Forest. Say that 5 times real fast. We appreciate your initiative on that and motivating a lot of other people and generating funds and getting support of the church there at South 40th Street. That's great. The other connection is going back to something Ali said, and that's to recognize Dr. Ann Vitiver again, who is really the motivating force behind the Doctor of Plant Health program. And Ann, I think you can see that the program is in good hands, good shape, with some really talented people that are going out and doing good stuff. So back to diversity again. We need diversity in our own department. Later, I've got an extra window on my screen, but that's all right. Okay. We started out by honoring Dr. Morris, and we appreciate what she did to help integrate us. We'll look at our department here in a moment and show you how it's changed over the years since I've been here. I think she was the only woman faculty member and teacher when I came 40-some years ago. We really broadened the scope, both gender-wise and to be a truly international group. So on the next slide here, you'll see, next slide, what our department looks like today, which is, I was amazed when I put this together. Out of 70-some people, we have 20% of us are women, and we come from 13 different countries. I don't think there was anybody from outside the US when I arrived here. It started in 1977. So this brings an awful lot to the department. It brings new ideas, field experiences, cultural experiences, things that are different in different languages, and just, we're really proud of what's going on in our department. Yet that's not the only kind of diversity we need. If all these people, no matter how diverse they look, all have the same ideas, then we're not really very diverse. So we need to have more people thinking about whole systems and looking at the big picture. Even in the leadership, or especially in leadership, the next slide shows that 3 of my bosses, Dr. Awada on the bottom there is Associate Dean in the Ag Research Division. Her family's from Lebanon originally, and scientist in the School of Natural Resources. My teaching boss is Dr. Tiffany Hang Moss, who's a Nebraskan and an entomologist. Then my immediate boss is from Ethiopia. Martha Mamo is a soil scientist. She's our head. She's been leading us through this whole COVID adjustment in a real effective way, and just a super good leader. So I want you to know that we're a fairly diverse group on East Campus, and it doesn't look like it did when I came back in '77. So that will wind up here. One last quote from Dr. Gro Harlem Brundtland, who, surprise, happened to be from Norway and was Prime Minister of Norway and then head of the World Health Organization. But she said, as part of this UN commission called Our Common Future, we need to use the natural resources very carefully today to meet our needs, but not in a way that reduces the choices and options for future generations. So again, thanks very much for joining us. And we thank again Dr. Morris and Dr. Vittever for leading the way and helping this whole diversity thrust. So thanks for joining us, and we hope you have some questions. You can put those in either live by raising your hand or unmuting and shouting out, or you can put them in the chat room. I don't see any chats down there, but you can put your questions in the chat room if you want. So thank you very much for the invitation, Arliss.
Thank you, Chuck. I want to thank the 3 of you. We've known Chuck forever and ever. And Allie and Wally are new to many of us, so thank you to all 3 of you for tonight's program. I just have a couple other announcements. One is that next month's program will be during Prairie Month, which is September. So Wachiska's Conservation Committee is providing that program. And they have many beautiful photos that will be shared, and that'll be September 10th. Then, by the way, all information for the September newsletter should be here in the office by this Saturday, the 15th. The last announcement is that Audubon's Rose Sanctuary and Spring Creek Prairie are now open from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. Monday through Friday. Masks are required to be worn inside the centers, and hand sanitizing stations are available throughout the buildings. The center's walking trails are open sunrise to sunset, 7 days a week. Masks are not required outside as long as social distancing practices are followed. So, Stu, do you have anything else to say?
I got a question for Chuck. I was wondering what he thinks will be the inflection point for the growth of the human population. I can remember one time, and I'm old enough to remember, when we said indeed we thought 7 billion people was going to be, going to top it out. Well, we've passed that. Now then it was 9 billion. And just only recently, now they're talking about 11 billion. Now the question is, this perpetual growth is impossible on a limited planet. So I'm wondering here what the thought is. I realize food isn't very important, but it doesn't take a lot of land to produce enough food for one person. The problem I'm looking at is, where do you think there's going to be, at what point do you think there's going to be a point of inflection for the population, and what's going to cause that point of inflection?
Well, that's a great question. I guess I'm unmuted.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, some people think that the sustainable population of the Earth is 2 billion, so we're already way beyond that. I think you can see the growth curves if you look at countries in Eastern Europe, which have declined in population. and would be much greater in their decline if it were not for immigrants from other places. But the projections really are pretty solid right now that we're going to top out at around 10 billion. And you can look at models that show all kinds of things. We've pushed the population bomb projections into the future by the Green Revolution and producing a lot more food. But like you say, Stu, there's never been any other critters that have survived forever, and they have to be in balance with the environment, and we're not at this point. So we're kind of past the tipping point, some would say. But I guess it's up to our human ingenuity to solve these problems and come up with good creative systems type solutions before nature does it for us and starts eliminating us due to lack of food or fighting with each other too much or whatever else.
Or future pandemics.
Yeah, good point, Carolyn.
Yeah.
Chuck, this is Arliss. I just realized now that Rosalyn Morris has joined us at some point. It probably was quite a while ago, but I wanted you to know that she's on here. Rosalyn.
Great. Hi, Roz. Great to see you. I should go back to that quote that was on the very first slide. Let me find it again. I want to say this again.
Yeah.
So that Rosalyn can hear it. I'm sure she remembers it.
It's coming.
Yeah, it's coming. Whoops. Got my password in twice. That won't work. Yeah, Rosalyn, on your 100th birthday, someone who I think was probably one of your graduate students from Australia said, if the drive for perfectionism was ever to take a human form, it would be Rosalyn. You probably remember that. Was that one of your students? We think so. Oh yeah, you need to be unmuted. If somebody's there, can unmute.
There.
Still muted, according to mine.
I can't do it.
And Teresa?
Yeah, I can't do anymore.
Yes, Lana.
Moderator ought to be able to unmute somehow.
Yeah.
Here.
No, not yet.
Oh, maybe she is. Rosalyn? Can you hear Chuck now? Ooh.
You can hear us.
It says chat.
There's a little red microphone.
Yeah, I know.
Rosalyn, if you
She
pick that, we'll be able to hear you.
must be on her end. I can't do it.
Yeah,
Okay.
she has to unmute on her end. Even though the moderator unmuted her, she has to do it herself.
Oh,
Well, we can read your lips, Rosalyn. Okay. Thank you for joining us.
Okay. Anybody else have anything?
Yeah, Arliss, I have a question.
Yeah.
Probably for Allie, kind of just some ideas. On your 10 principles, one of those you listed was something about growing younger farmers.
Yes.
And to me, one of the challenge, I think that they're key to moving forward, but one of the challenges was how do you get the young farmers to not learn from the old ways from the old farmers?
Yeah, I think that's it's an interesting question in a lot of ways, because my perception is that there are certainly some farmers who are some young farmers who are being mentored directly by a family member or a current farmer. And then there are also a separate group of folks who didn't grow up on farms or don't have family members with farms, who are learning from different sources and reading books and talking to other, smaller scale diversified farmers, and learning from them instead. So I think it's I think for the agronomy department, we sit in a really fascinating place from my perspective. I'm not from Nebraska, but hearing the number of undergrads go around and say that they intend to go home and farm, I think that's where we have this big opportunity at the university to introduce systems thinking and introduce, you know, ideas that push folks' comfort zones and their knowledge. And a number of them, Chuck does a nice exercise in his course where students reflect on various points in the course, and a number of them have said, you know, this is something that I want to ask my dad about or ask my grandpa about and see if we can implement. So I think there is a lot of energy that that can be put towards different practices and farming in a different way, and not following the status quo. Because I think, unfortunately, a lot of students have this like firsthand experience of the status quo not working that well. And so if we're able to equip them with ways of thinking and resources to look towards, to do things a little bit differently, I think that's where especially the university has a big opportunity.
I wonder how any of them can afford to farm anymore.
Right.
Good question. I have a couple of examples. One on the profitability that you just asked about. Farmers haven't really made money except for the farm programs since early in the last decade, since 2012 or 13, when prices were so high for corn. Everybody made money. Since then, profits have been awful slim, close to none. We just did an analysis of a long-term rotation out at the grain place in Marquette, and people made more money rotating corn and soybeans year in, year out, because the cost of production for soybeans were lower, and the price for soybeans is pretty good, but the production costs were low, so they made a lot more money just rotating a two-year, two-crop rotation. And if they used an organic system for the corn and soybeans, they made more money. In fact, it was profitable every year, unlike conventional. Another thing about learning to farm, I was talking to Riley Renke at the farmer's market on Sunday. He said, you know, I went down to this grazing workshop down in Kansas, and they had crops and animals in rotation. I learned more, and the guy that was moderating it said, hey, you're going to learn more in 3 days than I did in 8 years of school and graduate school about how to farm. And I said, well, that's good. You know, that's where you learn to farm. When you come to the university, you're coming to learn to think and to sort through a lot of systems, and not to learn just what other people are doing. And something that one of your prize students who graduated a couple of years ago, Lee Reese from North Dakota, was the one that hit me real hard. He said, you know, plant diagnostics is a tough job to figure out whether it's an insect or disease or too much water or not enough nitrogen, but all those things are pretty easy compared to the people part of my job. And he's a crop consultant up in North Dakota, and he was in fact got an award for being the best crop consultant in the US about 2 or 3 years ago. But he said he really believes it's a human activity system and it's people that need to be understood. So we're looking with Allie and Gary, your successor, with ways to diagnose people and how they think and how they make decisions. And that's a different kind of diagnostic. So anyway, I'll just
against an industry that tries to sell us anything they come up with, not necessarily good for us.
Yep, everybody's in the business of selling something.
Just go ahead, Paul. I wanted to make a comment about farmer's myth. A couple years ago on Ragbri, with a bicycle ride across to Iowa, where the scenery is corn and soybeans, and where they have people from all 50 states and about 14 foreign countries trying to explain to people that soybean is not your edamame or your tofu, and that corn over there is not your corn flakes. Mm-hmm. And so many of them were absolutely surprised when I try to explain to them how little that actually ever winds up on your table.
This Good Earth was a good book.
Yeah, I hope a lot of you saw that book, The Good Earth. Good. Any other comments or questions?
Yeah, the other fact, farmer's myth, this idea that farmers can feed the world, definitely. You hear that so often, it gets kind of old after a while. Farmers are not going to feed the world. Farmers are going to feed the world only to the extent that it's profitable to do so. And that is the weakness in the whole system, is how do you go to work and farmers are trying to cheapen it up, but the people who are hungry are not the ones who have the money to pay for the food.
Well, we need to support our local farmers markets and stuff, but the prices are higher, but they're better products. But
which I do here in Geneva. We have a farmers market, but you know, it certainly doesn't take up much of the total amount of land that's in agriculture right now. It doesn't account for that much.
Well, and UNL kept going to Brazil and other countries too, didn't they, about talking to them about products and anyway.
Well, the whole paradigm is kind of twisted when it comes to agriculture. I mean, at one time, India, well, it might still be true, but India's people were starving, but their farmers were still exporting food.
Yeah.
Now you figure that out.
Well, some of ours probably are too. I had an orange the other day from Africa. I was surprised about that, but we have so many of our fruits and stuff from different countries.
I have a question,
Anyway.
Chuck.
Yeah.
It seemed like there are a lot of ideas flying around about providing financial support for farmers who will work on carbon sequestration, pulling carbon out of the air and keeping it in the soil. And I'm wondering about what you think about the project that's organized by NORI, N-O-R-I. Does that strike you as realistic or having a future, or what do you think?
Yeah, I'm not real familiar with that one, Marilyn, but
Okay.
carbon sequestration is really important, just like clean water and, you know, finding ways to produce food while we're providing all these ecosystem services. And I know you wrote some months ago about regenerative agriculture, and is that going to solve all the problems? And sure, if we do all those things, probably will. It's also nothing new because Bob Rodale wrote a book about that about
exactly.
5 years ago.
They keep rediscovering it.
Yeah, and we rediscover things that farmers have known for a long time too. And part of our job is learning from farmers, and then, you know, figuring out the mechanisms and figuring out why they work, and putting some confidence into the things people are doing already, and and then going through extension to get those out to other people.
Wait. You don't happen to know how many schools in Lincoln, Nebraska, or other towns in Nebraska have gardens and are teaching their kids?
Good question. I just read today, Lloyd Bell is retiring from ag leadership and education. He said there are 200 ag programs in Nebraska now, which is up quite a bit. So I think I know there are in Douglas County and some urban, peri-urban places. So I think the numbers of ag programs have grown, and a lot of these are people that Ollie mentioned that are coming in to ag from outside. And this is kind of a good thing because she also mentioned that farmer age is about 58 years or 58 years or 59 now. So within 10 years, half of our farm owner manager population is going to turn over. So there's a chance for young farmers, and we're working together with Center for Rural Affairs on training programs for veterans who want to go into farming, and young farmers, and Native American groups and Hispanics and others. So I think there is a new generation coming along, and it's a question of how we interface and figure out how to communicate with these folks and go in the right direction, as you suggest.
If we could get more community crops too.
Elliott Elementary has a big school garden.
I know some do.
And several churches have started, community gardens. We've got one on 17th Street just down from the Ferguson house here that's pretty good sized.
There are about 10 or 12 of those community gardens around. It's fun to visit those because you meet people from all around the world, make some good friendships. And we trade plants with folks at the one here near us.
I told them they could have my yard, but they didn't follow up on that.
I hope a lot of you know about Holly Hamlet too. I don't know if Tim's still on. Tim, do you want to say a word about Holly Hamlet? You on mute?
Tim isn't here tonight. He had another meeting.
Oh, I see his name on the screen here.
Well, there's somebody else in there.
Come out, whoever you are.
Are there any other questions?
This is Roxanne. I just wanted to make the comment on what Chuck said in one of the slides, that turf is our largest crop. And I think that if we look at agriculture, and especially urban agriculture, one of the good things that come from the pandemic is that people have time to actually plant a garden at home and start growing their own food at home. And when we look at agriculture, we can look at turning our urban environments into food production and into agriculture, and hopefully get away from irrigated, over-fertilized, over-pesticide turf.
Yeah, thanks, Roxanne. I'll quote one of our golf students who took the agroecology class a few years ago. He said that golf courses are really good because at least they're not paved over, and they're kind of a long-term set-aside for when we really need all that land for food. So I quote that student all the time.
Well, I guess indeed, does anybody got any further comment? I guess we can adjourn the meeting.
I was just going to say
Thank
that
you very
Tim,
much, Chuck, for your presentation. Appreciated it very much and very informative.
I was just going to say that Tim mentioned the book Nature's Best Hope. If anyone's interested in reading up about a new approach to conservation that starts in your yard.
Yep, that's a good book. Thanks to all three presenters.
Yes.
A lot of info.
Thanks for having us.
All right, good night.
That should be it for tonight. And remember, next month in September, we're going to be talking about prairies, Wachiska's prairies. So hope to see you